I've got the pleasure to chair on the panel for blockchain in practice. So before we explore that topic area, let's do a quick round of introductions. Alex, would you like to take us away?
Yeah, my name's Alex Foto. You'll see my name written as Alessandro. That's my Italian side. I'm with a company called Consensus. That's a venture production studio based in Brooklyn, but now with folks all over the world. And we produce decentralized applications and developer tools primarily for the Ethereum ecosystem, and doing a lot of standards work as well with the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, which is trying to help companies sort of figure out how they want to use Ethereum and create standards amongst themselves.
Hey guys, my name is Tim Swanson. I do strategic advisory work for several different tech companies, primarily in the fintech space. I've been doing quote unquote blockchain related research for 5-6 years now. I originally did mining back in China back in 2012. No, I don't have any of those coins. Don't try to kidnap me or anything like that. And I guess since I'm sitting next to you, I guess it was a joke. If you're within the Consensus sphere, I must be a spoke of Consensus.
Oh yeah.
we're already merging here. So no, it's great to be here. Thank you for hosting this event, and Brett, wherever you are, thank you for the food too.
It was really good.
Cool, and just to finish introductions off, I'm Adam Dunnett. I'm a senior tax manager at Fitzgerald & Law. We're an international expansion specialist with offices in San Francisco and London. So concentrating on the title of the panel, so blockchain in practice, I guess let's start with jumping into some real life use cases that we've seen this year that have had some traction, that have seen some success. So Alex, would you like to kick us off?
Sure thing, yeah. So I mean, I think a lot of this year was seeing kind of trusting the blockchain. So a lot of folks had created internal projects or kind of limited proofs of concept where they saw how these systems worked on like a small test net or something. And this is the year I think we're going to start, even for the rest of the year, starting to see things actually have the rubber hit the road and start to see things in what some people might actually call quote production, which has been this sort of elusive milestone. We saw specifically in like the social good space, we saw folks actually get fed more because the UN World Food Program was able to distribute funds more usefully, more cheaply to Syrian refugees living in Jordan by using retinal scanners and everything. So people would go up and basically, instead of having bank cards where they would have to charge them up and there were all these bank transfer fees and everything, folks would just go up to their local merchant, put their eye in a scanner, and it would deduct from a balance that was stored on Ethereum, and basically get their food. And at the end of the day, the merchant just has to settle the balance of all of the food that had been purchased that day. So that drastically cut down transaction costs, allowed people to have more foods in their bellies, helped the UN be basically more lean in its operations. And so that kind of approach, surprisingly, that was one of the first things that I really felt demonstrated, like, wow, this stuff actually could work. This actually is starting to gain traction. That was really exciting to see, especially for a social good group. And I knew when they actually had come to me just before they actually launched that, and they knew exactly what they wanted. They knew their people. They felt that urgency around people who were actually starving. And I think many of us need to kind of interact at that level, like really, really feel the urgency around true needs instead of just kind of throwing out, an ICO topic and hoping that it sticks. Obviously a lot of the stuff, Tim's done and been following around, banks and interledger, shared bank ledgers and bank transfers and stuff has been progressing, and folks are actually starting to trust that in the banking sector. Tons of things actually happening in advertising, marketing. So the supply chain use cases, we're finally getting those systems reinforced, but now we're starting to think, okay, how do we actually use this? What is this actually good for? So I think we're at the point now where these things are working and we're starting to trust what they say, and it's a question of now where's the value in that and how are we going to start applying that to real business?
Alex, I'm not sure if you're going to like me ask you this, but for the benefit of the audience,
sure.
What do you think the benefit the UN saw of using Ethereum versus using some kind of traditional existing system?
I don't think they're actually, Ethereum might have allowed for folks to store their credentials securely in a way that was decentralized, so they didn't have to trust an organization to manage their account. And assuming this was a platform where other aid organizations can participate, you're not just relying on the UN World Food Program to manage that account, manage that balance, and define when and how those folks can spend it. It's an allocation that's given, and folks can then pay for it. So it works as the basis of a decentralized system that might emerge. Now, that could have been done in a centralized way with some detraction in the ability for other folks to, or some ability for folks to be able to like halt services or delete that identity. So I think that was really important. It could have been done on Hyperledger or a whole host of other decentralized platforms. But it was exciting to see Ethereum. They saw that the developer tools, I think, were quite easy to do. And I remember when they came to me, they were like, we want this done in the next month. Like, we're not interested in some consulting project that's going to take forever. So for urgency, the developer use was out there, and identity services were really easy to get.
We'll just keep on asking Alex questions. So I guess to answer your original question, I think Conferences is the killer app of blockchains. No, sorry, Brett. No, I think class action lawsuits were the other big thing this year. So again, that's not an actual use case. It's just what ends up happening with all the fraud in the ICO market. To piggyback what Alex was saying, if you guys are looking for things to look up for homework, look up TradeLens. That was just announced last week. IBM announced with Maersk that they have over 90 participants on a supply chain network using Fabric. They also have a platform called WeTrade. Back to what Alex was saying with banks, is over a dozen different large European banks have built out a trade finance set of applications on top of, again, Fabric. I guess R3 has Marco Polo. There's several of these. Is anyone a trade finance expert? No, supply chain? Anyone wearing a wire? I mean, you guys, what do you, you guys lawyers? Lots of smiles on that one. So yeah, as far as use cases, this was supposed to be the year of production. I guess the first half of the year was mostly the year of the pilot, and maybe you've had some things turn on. Like I think HKMA just announced with Ping An about a month ago that they had launched with over 20 participants out in Asia with their own trade finance platform. Singapore is currently bidding RFP, doing something very similar. It's GTCN are the initials. So happy to talk to you guys about this offline, about specific things that are turning on production on the enterprise side. To quickly front run the question about why it's taken so long, it's because of having to go through, number one, stakeholder management, making sure everyone approves from various committees, regulators, and also you have to be able to interact with the existing legacy infrastructure. It's not being, you don't turn off stuff just because the magic word blockchain is used. So I think that's the short answer to your question.
The other thing I just wanted to mention too is like I think we largely, when I had in my mind like use cases, generally that's a question that's asked for enterprise use cases. Or what are seen as enterprise use cases. But what's really exciting is that a lot of these blockchain-based public use platforms have continued to function and improve their usability. So things like Uport and other kind of identity platforms like Sovereign, still continuing their work, and they're actually working on standards to actually help onboard folks to use those tools more readily. The infrastructure that runs a lot of these decentralized systems. So in our world at Consensus, we run something called Infura, handling billions, actually billions and billions of transactions, of reads and many writes to the system and not exploding. It's pretty incredible. We've been able to sustain this massive interest in tokens, which are still in most cases securely held and working just fine. Save maybe Parity Wallet and some other.
Shots fired.
Things are actually working quite smoothly in this decentralized space. So even amongst the kind of anarchist, sort of open, uncontrollable, uncensorable world, we're starting to see some things actually play out. And the other thing, back to the sort of social good space, or arguably social good. I mean, depending on where you sit on this, is we had heard that some folks, and this is actually technically not really blockchain. More IPFS and other decentralized web technologies, but we heard that some folks in the Catalan region in Spain who were trying to vote had their voting polls, the physical ones, torn down. Folks were arrested. They were trying to vote on the referendum to leave Spain online, but people were taking down those servers and charging the folks who actually hosted those sites. And then they had hosted that site on Interplanetary File System, IPFS, which is a way to host decentralized content, and they were unable to actually take down that site. So that was a democratic voting system that could be used to start literally a revolution that was unable to be taken down by government forces. So that's actually the beginning of something that is literally, it's absolutely world-changing, and I think points to some of these real anti-censorship qualities that we saw as Ethereum as being potentially useful for. Not to mention Augur and prediction markets and other sorts of things that just came out that are really fun to play with, even if they have very few folks actually using them now.
And assassination markets. So, real quick question for you on that, since we're asking questions here. What happens if a court doesn't recognize an election as being valid that takes place on Ethereum or IPFS?
Yeah, so that's the thing is basically no one cares what's on your database. Like I can create an Excel spreadsheet and say I won an election, and and that's I think where this year I want to see folks say we're creating the processes and business procedures and governance procedures around this data, this information that's being stored, to actually take action on it and hold ourselves accountable for taking action on this stuff. For anything that's not digitally verifiable, you need someone that can go and put you in jail if you don't do stuff, or to fight back if people don't do stuff. So enforcement has to happen, and that is a business process thing that people are evolving and trying to actually create around this stuff. So just because you have a blockchain doesn't mean stuff's actually going to happen. If courts don't recognize it, at least it stands as an undeletable testament of popular opinion, but you still need to enforce it somehow.
Okay. And when you have a good idea or a venture that seems to have some potential longevity, what's the kind of main challenges or barriers that you're seeing in the market for those to transition to a success?
Yeah, I mean, off stage we were talking about Brexit just a moment ago. So that gives a real world example of a challenge. Things like GDPR, these large macro events, if you're building out a platform for enterprises, especially those that do cross-jurisdictional transactions or have property that they've digitized and are trying to move across borders, these issues have not, to my knowledge, the folks behind the GDPR, there's supposed to be fines, millions of dollars worth of fines that are supposed to be enforced right now, but nobody really is being sued because of different grace periods. When those grace periods go up, and when we have, the October, whether there's an agreement or not in the UK, that's where we get to see what fault tolerance looks like on these blockchain-related systems. They haven't been put to the test yet. So ask me again when we see fines take place. Will people pay them, or will they say these fines don't apply to me because of blockchain, something like that. So I think it's worth looking at again in 3 or 4 months.
Okay. Yeah, and also, so a lot of 2017, again, a lot of proofs of concepts that happened from individual companies. Many of them seeking PR reports or something like that, or just legitimately actually trying to explore the space, which is important. And we supported a lot of those kinds of things of folks exploring the space. But what has to happen is you can't have a blockchain system and be the only one on it, right? I hope everyone realizes that's completely useless. It's like you're storing a Google sheet or Excel spreadsheet where you're the only contributor. You're not really doing much. So you had to have multiple parties who mutually did not trust each other, but somehow trusted this technology amongst it. And in order to do that, in order to make that platform useful to other folks, you can't just have a company say, hey, we figured it out and you all have to buy our solution and onboard onto our thing. It takes a lot of partnership discussion. It takes standards and common APIs, and that's a lot of the work that's been happening at consortia like R3, Hyperledger, and for what I've been involved in, the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, where we're starting to have these discussions at the industry level, like in an identity solution for the telecom space, like what are the parameters? How do we deal with user identity? How is that dealt with in a roaming context? Where does that hit with these legacy systems? And those conversations are slow, but really important as people start to kind of figure out how to use this stuff.
What is the general lead time on that development? Can you put it into months, or is it years? Or?
Well, the announcement with the IBM project this past week was they said it was a year long to get 90 plus participants. No, it's unclear about how active they are in participation. If you look at other consortia, Marco Polo with TradeIX is the vendor that actually built that out with R3. That took at least 9-12 months too. So it's not a short period of time. It doesn't take, if we're out here in the Bay Area, everyone thinks with a couple dudes in a coffee shop with a laptop that they could build out. If you're trying to do stuff on enterprise scale, you're gonna have to deal with enterprise timelines. So it's not something you could do in a couple months probably.
Yeah, and it depends, you can stand up a system that commits to the blockchain, does kind of what you want. Again, as Tim mentioned, enterprise grade means quite a bit, and we're actually trying to define that. The Enterprise Ethereum Alliance is producing a specification that we're doing the second iteration of now by DevCon and it's basically defining what does it mean for something to be enterprise grade in the Ethereum space. And we're hoping actually that helps inform other groups that are looking at defining what is an enterprise grade blockchain solution. So that includes things like privacy, transaction throughput, permissioning, all these kind of thorny issues that folks have felt kind of uncomfortable about using blockchains for. Now we're trying to define some common APIs, common standards around this system must achieve this, or it should have this interoperability, or so those things are. It's easy to kind of produce them, but to actually have many folks implement against those and build that momentum takes a good deal of time. But I think if you're trying to pump your coin, it's not fast enough. If you're trying to create a next generation kind of economic structure, I think we can wait a few years.
Okay.
Is this where we start pumping coins? That's what I was told to do. So.
And how difficult is it from an enterprise standpoint when there's limited regulation or regulation that can't be specifically relied upon? What's your kind of insights and take around that area?
Yeah, so especially with these large consortia, full disclosure, I used to work at R3 and I'm still an advisor to Clearmatics, and they both have built these large consortia for financial institutions. You have to bring in the regulators. So you bring in the central banks. For example, Clearmatics and R3 are both involved in the Bank of England phase 2 of their DLT RTGS pilot, and that takes a year plus long, and that's just one regulator. The FCA has a sandbox. I keep talking about UK stuff, and we're not talking about any US stuff right now. Although I guess there are some, the CFPB just announced they're going to do a sandbox too, but you have to proactively engage regulators. If you ignore them, then they'll be suspicious of whatever your activities are. They're not going to go away. They all have budgets. As much as the anarchists want the state to wither and die, it's not going to happen, at least not in that time frame. So I would say reach out to the regulators that you feel have either a mandate to look at what you're working on, or you actually want them on your network, and that could take more than a lunch. So expect to find try to bring on advisors who could give you those types of door openings.
Yeah, we also saw. Augur, this prediction market launched, and it was the first time where we started to see, not the first time. There had been many examples from Bitcoin and its derivatives prior to that, but where it was a truly distributed system where things were on there, like Tim mentioned, even some things around assassination markets, where you cannot do anything about it. And when the folks were asked about it, they said, well, it's a decentralized platform, and we do our best to make sure that the technology doesn't promote that use and all that other stuff. But I think we will start to see, in the enterprise space, it's important to deal with regulation, but for a lot of the tools that exist in these spaces, they'll be used for good and bad. And I think if you were caught up in the hype, you might not have realized the true long-term implications of having a system that no one can stop. No one can delete things from. So I think we're still going to see how regulators and activists and enterprises are going to deal with a world where, despite their best intentions, other parties might be trying to hack things. There's a lot that we need to do to actually reinforce these systems, and also to bake in our beliefs, bake in what we think should not be on these systems, and enforce those rules in order that to make sure that they promote the right kinds of use cases and prevent use cases where things can be used for evil. And there will always be the possibility someone creates those things, but our goal is to kind of guide people toward the right things.
So you're not okay with the enterprise grade assassination market, is that?
Absolutely.
Okay, just making sure we're clear on that. All right.
Absolutely not.
Do you think sandbox is the way to go, or does it just need to be a general shift in the regulation landscape?
So I'm not a regulator. I do talk to regulators quite a lot as part of my role. You hear about sandboxes, greenhouses, beaches. You hear all these different analogies. I don't think there's a perfect one, and obviously each country has their own different set of cultural around that. I just. It would be great if there was more harmonization. G20 is trying to work on various harmonizations with AML laws around cryptocurrencies, for example. But it's a slow slog. It's the reason why we have 200 plus countries effectively. So ask me again in 6 months if that's changed. But no, I think there's a regulatory panel at this event, so I think that'd be probably a better question to ask.
Yeah, fine. So kind of directing it back onto use cases. So I think we've kind of covered some general use cases. We're leaning towards that kind of division between conceptual ideas and real life application, and there's still some momentum that needs to happen for us to get to genuine application. Do we do we see the most success cases coming from larger conglomerates like the IBMs, or do we think it's going to happen with smaller, perhaps more nimble SMEs?
Well, so it takes significant development resources to create a system that is, again, enterprise grade or cannot be attacked. So I think it's important that those folks, whether it's Consensus, IBM, other folks are working on these problems at scale. What's important is that the things that we build are reusable by others in the space, because at this point it's not really like you choose one company and they're going to have that kind of defeats the purpose, right? We're talking about a decentralized world. You should not have a centralized solution with one company kind of running the show and preventing others from interoperating. So like a lot of how like our spokes, for example, are structured is that they are things that other developers can build on. So like Uport, for example, you can build use cases on top of that for identity, which is why even they're partnering with other organizations to actually standardize there's the Digital Identity Foundation, I think, and the DID spec, basically decentralized identifier specification that allows other folks to interoperate, that allows folks to use those tools and put them into their own systems. So I think it's a combination of these big resources being applied to reinforcing the protocols and making good platform solutions, and then smaller companies exploring the edges and kind of testing new markets.
Okay.
To answer your question, again, I don't want to be down on startups, so I'll give you an example of a startup that seems to have gotten some kind of traction, and it's a company called Axoni. They just announced today that they raised $32 million from several different banks. Actually, if you look at their entire cap table that's been announced in terms of investors, it's all institutions, but they're a startup that's trying to take these ideas that we've talked about on this panel and other panels and try to effectively integrate them into the institutional world, primarily financial institutions, capital markets. They are an exception, though, because their original company, what was the original name of Axoni? It's called TradeBlock. It popped up 4 years ago as a Bitcoin company to help out pricing and various other things. That company still exists, but this is a spun out. So that didn't succeed 4 years ago because of the bear market. And so they're like, well, hey, what can we do with enterprises? So that's what Axoni was created from. So, but again, they're an exception. There's only about a dozen or so companies that have managed to, including Consensus Solutions, I guess that's your spoke. Only about a dozen companies who've managed to survive the last 3 years in the capital market side of the stuff. So it's a hard slog. If you plan to go out and build a startup on the enterprise side, I'm happy to talk to you about it. I don't want to be a complete cold water, but it is. It's not fun. It's a lot of boring meetings. You have to sit there for a year plus, so you need capital to burn in a long runway. It is possible. It's just you're going to be 5% of the companies that are able to survive that.
Yeah, I'll give you all a tip that will probably save you time, and maybe it's obvious to other people who have done products at companies, but. A lot of times when you go into a conversation with an enterprise, like they really have trouble articulating what they want. And so I think oftentimes if it's not one of the big use cases that's already had a lot of press about it, has already been researched and already thought through, if you're trying to pull stuff out of them with your intention of like, you need to use blockchain, we don't know for what, that's quite a difficult journey, and you're likely not going to be able to get any clarity. You say like, oh, what do you do that requires multiple parties that you can't mutually trust and that has these qualities and stuff? And those parameters are so difficult to actually pin, and the point of reflection on the company is actually quite difficult. So what I think a lot of companies are starting to realize is it's much, much better to just go out, do important market research, try to figure out where these solutions are, then present those to the company as a decentralized open source solution, and then try to figure out, how do we customize it so that they're able to onboard onto this. Also, so that these things remain open and they're not captured by one company, or that they're not sort of hampered and centralized. That's a much better approach. So create the sort of garden and then invite people to come and integrate with it and prune as necessary.
And would you say the talent is there to make these solutions a success at the moment?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there are tons of folks in the enterprise space that have come to realize just how important this is as a move toward a different kind of internet. Lots and lots of support that's happening there. Lots and lots of folks who want to see bigger scale from the things that they create and are ready to create integrations. Now we're finally starting to see these platforms take on real world projects. So yeah, I'm convinced that there's enough interest.
So we were just joking about this off stage. Like, it's one thing from if you've been involved in this quote-unquote space for a number of years, you have an idea of who's just talking baloney and who's not. But if you're an HR director, or you're brought in without having that filter already, just assume everyone's lying to you. That's really just the way to look at this space. As soon as they talk to you, they pitch you just assume that they're not telling you the truth. The HR people, unfortunately, they don't have that same cynical view that they really should have. As a result, they end up wasting the entrepreneur's time. Again, I know that you guys have had to ramp up to 1,100 employees now, so I'm sure that's been a fun process. But if you're trying to build out a subject matter group internally at your company, assume that a significant portion of the people that you interview don't have the capacity or don't have the capabilities that they're talking about. You go onto LinkedIn, it's a complete mess. Like everyone says that they're some kind of blockchain expert, developer. I mean, and then conversely, you have enterprises say, you need to have 10 years or something experience. I mean, even Satoshi himself wouldn't qualify for that. So it's a fun process, and I think that we're about to get yanked off the stage here.
Oh yeah. Last thing I'll mention about that is just that the goal should be that those folks don't need to know about Ethereum and don't need to know about blockchain. They might have a vague idea of why it's important to use a decentralized structure over another, but the goal is to figure out all the protocol level things, standard level needs, developer level tools, so folks can focus on saying, this is a trusted architecture, now what do I want to imagine or what do I want to create on top of that? So I think it'll get easier.
Great. I think we're out of time, so thank you all for attending. Thanks to the panelists for their...
Oh, should we do questions?
Yeah, let's
got a couple
to make sure
okay.
we left some time for some questions.
Hi. So it's a question about, you mentioned Ethereum has been in talk with enterprises, right? So you're a public blockchain. And so do you have one example of a use case where a public blockchain or decentralized solution is a good fit for an enterprise?
Yeah, so one correction,
Yeah.
We're not Ethereum. Ethereum's a protocol. Consensus is a company that builds on that. And a big misconception about Ethereum also is that it is only a public thing and Hyperledger and other things are the private thing. It's there are private implementations of Ethereum, and Hyperledger may one day, or they might be working on a way to actually combine chains to create a big network. Like we're all trying to get to the same thing, which is privacy, permissioning, and things that actually coalesce into one big internet with strong permissions and identity things. And on the public net side, we launched something called AdChain that basically you want to have wide participation in what's called a token curated registry, which is where the premise of AdChain basically is that there's tons of robot, click fraud of robots going out and clicking on ads, trying to gain revenue for the folks, for the websites, right? And so there are some websites that you can't really trust to advertise on because they're just going to milk your bounty on the ad. So what AdChain is, it's deployed on the public net, it's available to advertisers, and what it is, it's a registry, it's a list of reputable websites that do not employ robotic click bots, and in order to get yourself onto that list to be seen by advertisers as a legitimate company, you have to put up a stake, or someone has to nominate you and put up a money that is held in escrow. And if someone can prove that you do actually do fraudulent things and that you're not worthy of being on that list, they can challenge you, and if others agree, then you lose that monetary stake. And it needs to be high enough that it actually is painful to you. That's how you parameterize it. So in that sense, you don't want that amongst a private group of folks who all are kind of able to create a small little cartel and side with their buddies that they're not actually doing click fraud, right? You want a widely participatory network, all of whom may have asymmetric access to information about use on that system. You want that list to maintain its integrity. You want the coins to stay on the escrow thing and not be moved around by any subset of those folks, like a third of them or half of them. You want this to be a robust structure, and Ethereum or another public net system that is of comparable size and distribution, I think is absolutely necessary for something, and that benefits advertisers.
And just to be the contrarian, the number one app right now is a multi-level marketing pyramid scheme called FOMO 3D. So if you're looking to securitize Yeah, it's really called FOMO 3D. So look it up. Again, I'm not endorsing it, but yeah, it's the #1 DApp. That's because it needs censorship resistance.
So if you ever put together a panel, you always have to put Tim on it because he will always have a contrarian comment come back.
Tim's awesome.
Thank you.
He's one of my favorite people in this industry, and he's like, I don't even think you like blockchain. So it's like I'm like, you could pick a different industry. Like, you don't have to do this for a living.
Okay. Thanks, Brett. Appreciate it.
He said with love. Well, let's give a big round of applause. And like I said, these are some of my favorite people in the industry. So thank you guys so much for coming out.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.